This week on Brian Ross Investigates.
Officials say 153 people are on board American Airlines Flight 965.
Dangerous air? A veteran pilot investigates what led to the crash of this American Airlines 757 jetliner.
The crew reportedly radioed in with engine trouble moments before it crashed.
This was a crew that was probably the most experienced crew you could have had. I believe they were cognitively impaired.
Is oil from the jet engines bleeding into the cockpit, causing the pilots to lose their bearings and passengers and flight attendants to get sick?
I think passengers deserve to know what's going on.
So this issue continues to this day.
It absolutely continues to this day.
Plus, COVID-19 cases on the rise with the new Delta variant.
New infections have risen 16% week over week, with hospitalizations jumping 8.6%.
Former Acting Surgeon General Dr. Boris Lushniak is here with some disturbing facts. And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite.
They don't hear evidence. What they hear is, you're a dummy for not getting this.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. I'm Brian Ross, joined as always by my colleague at Law&Crime, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with a fascinating story about what pilots and flight attendants call the smelly socks problem. That's how they describe a smell that comes in the cockpit and in the cabin that they say is caused by oil from the engine bleeding into the airflow. Now, it may sound like a petty, minor nuisance, but as we're about to see, Rhonda, it can lead to some very serious issues.
That's right, Brian. A new investigative documentary out this week by a veteran pilot says that tainted air has caused pilots to become disoriented, with what he says is at least one tragic outcome.
I just remember being on the plane and I was fighting with my brother. And I remember seeing the lights. And then after that, I don't remember much. But waking up the next day.
Now, updating the hour's top story, it may be nearly 4 hours before rescue teams can begin searching for a downed aircraft in the rugged Andes Mountains. Officials say 153 people are on board American Airlines Flight 965. The crew reportedly radioed in with engine trouble moments before it crashed northeast of Cali.
It came down in a mountainous region and burst into flames. The survivors are said to be 2 men, a woman, and a child. It's not yet known what caused the crash.
The official finding was pilot error. But for years, former British Air pilot Tristan Lorraine has maintained there is another explanation. And in his new documentary film, American 965, Captain Lorraine lays out the case that oil fumes from the engine made their way into the cockpit and the cabin, causing the pilots to become disoriented.
As they got closer to the ground proximity warning system activated. The crew instinctively pushed the thrust levers forward and pitched the nose up to try and climb out of trouble. Sadly, the engines take time to spool up to full power, and despite their efforts, 13 seconds later at 21:41, the aircraft hit the ground, just under 9,000 feet, just below the top of a mountain ridge near Buga.
And we're joined now by Tristan Lorraine and also Michelle Barron, one of the few to survive the crash. She was 6 years old at the time. Thank you both for being here. Let me start by asking you, Captain Lorraine, what led you to do this investigation and this documentary?
Well, I was a former Boeing 757 captain, which is the same airplane that happened in the Cali crash. And I was also a union health and safety rep. And in 2001, I was made aware of the issues that we look into in the film. And it made me start to question maybe the Cali crash, there was more to it than the investigators had first told us. And that's how the journey started.
Under your theory, what do you think happened?
So basically, when you're on an airplane as a passenger or crew member, that the air you breathe on the airplane is provided to you from the engines unfiltered, and it's known as bleed air. And when I flew the Boeing 757, we frequently used to smell this bleed air being contaminated. And when I mean contaminated, the oils in the engine or hydraulic fluids would contaminate the breathing air. And you could tell it was contaminated because it would have this kind of dirty sock kind of smell. Now, this contamination isn't something you want to be breathing. These oils contain very hazardous toxic chemicals, which can impair cognitive performance. And we were becoming more and more aware of more and more pilots becoming cognitively impaired from these oil fumes. And one case in point is we had a flight on approach to London Heathrow Airport where the crew forgot to slow the plane for landings. So air traffic control saved the day, asked them to abort the approach. And in the subsequent internal report, it states the flight crew were unaware they were becoming partially incapacitated due to oil fumes. So if it can happen to us in England, then there's no reason why it couldn't have happened to the Cali crew, especially when we know that aircraft had an oil leak in the engine that supplies the air the pilots breathe.
And what made you think the pilots of American 965 had become impaired?
Well, if you look at the way they acted during the flight, they made some really, really fundamental mistakes. Even in the way they were trying to work out how far they had to go from their position to landing when they were offered the straight-in approach, you can see cognitively that they weren't even adding up the maths. They weren't resorting to the absolute basics. And you have to remember, this was a crew that was probably the most experienced crew you could have had. The co-pilot was former United States Air Force Instructor of the Year, who was an expert low-level pilot. And the captain twice awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But on that night, I believe they were cognitively impaired, not to the point that they couldn't talk, but just enough that when the pressure came on, they couldn't cognitively work at the level they need to. And that's why they made the mistakes they did.
Did it ever happen to you, Captain, as you were flying 757s for British Air?
I've been cognitively impaired, but I used emergency oxygen. You know, I could feel mentally slow, so I've used emergency oxygen. And we've seen crews around the world that have been cognitively impaired by this.
It was a miracle that anyone survived the crash of American 965. 6-year-old Michelle Barron was trapped in the wreckage.
I fractured my left femur, and I lost all my nerves from the waist down. I didn't feel my legs at all because of the hypothermia and because I was buried from the waist down for 13 hours with my seatbelt on before they found me. I can't even imagine how I could have survived that.
Michelle, let me ask you, as you hear what Captain Lorraine has to say and his powerful documentary, what is your reaction to all that as one of the few to actually survive that crash?
It's mind-blowing to me because I can't believe that these big industries and corporations aren't being held accountable and preventing these, future tragedies. Like, I wouldn't want anybody to go through what I went through. So I think it's very mind-blowing to me that they haven't done anything about it.
Do you recall from back then any indication of the smelly socks odor in the cabin?
I do. I mean, I do now. Now, like I know I am more aware of that smell than when I was a child. Like, now that I'm aware of it, I can always remember that. I remember that distinct smell every time.
And Captain Lorraine, let me ask you now, has this not been corrected? Have they not taken some steps that involve strictly the Rolls-Royce engines? Is that correct?
Well, I used to fly for British Airways, and a lot of our airplanes were sold or passed on to DHL, the cargo airline, and their crews had exactly the same problems we did. But credit to DHL management, they installed a cockpit filter unit to filter the air to their pilots to protect them. So I wish my airline had done it, but DHL did it, and credit to them for doing that. But apart from that, no airliner in the world flying around has any form of filtration to filter the air from the engines. The only airplane where you cannot, have this problem occur is the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, because they don't use air from the engines, they use electrical compressors. And that's how every airplane should be built in the future.
So in addition to the pilots, of course, the passengers are also breathing this air. They're not performing highly skilled and very important functions, but it has an impact on them, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's really important when people are sitting on an airplane, nobody ever tells them, what does it actually say on the cans of oils or hydraulic fluids that people are being regularly exposed to? It says, do not breathe mist or vapor from heated product, suspected of causing cancer, risk to the unborn child, risk to infertility. I think passengers deserve to know what's going on, because at the end of the day, we all need aviation. Aviation is vital to the world economy. What we're saying is, here's a problem. It's going to cost maybe $60,000, $80,000 to fix it. Come on, let's fix the problem, and let's make sure that flight safety and public health can no longer be compromised.
So this issue continues to this day.
It absolutely continues to this day.
All right. Captain Tristan Lorraine, thank you so much. Michelle Barron, thank you so much for being here. Fascinating documentary and very important for everyone to take a look.
Thank you.
The engine maker Rolls-Royce told us it had no one available to answer any of our questions. The American Safety Agency, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, said the investigation of that crash was handled in Colombia, so we don't know if they're taking this issue seriously. Coming up next, confounding questions from the latest news on COVID-19. We'll get some straight talk answers from Dr. Boris Lushniak when we come back. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network. Turning now to some urgent questions being raised by the latest news in the COVID-19 pandemic. And to help us get a better understanding of what's really happening, we're joined by Dr. Boris Lushniak, the Dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland, and also a former acting Surgeon General. And Dr. Lushniak, again, thank you so much for being here. Let me ask you this. Did U.S. officials jump the gun? Is it too soon to take off masks and get back to normal?
Well, there's always a lot of second guessing on a lot of these approaches regarding this pandemic. Did we jump the gun? I don't think so. But what we have to be is wise enough to look at the public health situation in our communities and be able to back up where necessary. I think that's going to be a critical feature. What we're seeing right now is really, the dilemma that exists when the vaccination campaign isn't going in the direction we wanted it to go, right? So we've been at this since January in terms of vaccines being available. Right now, nationwide, we're approaching 50% of the population being fully vaccinated, with 67% having at least one dose. But what we're seeing, Brian, are the hotspot areas. And in essence, we have a decision to make. And the decision is either you get vaccinated or you're going to get COVID. And that's what we have to keep racing.
And do you think there's been any issue with the public messaging? That's what you do as a public health official. Are you satisfied with the way this has been conducted by both the Trump and the Biden administrations?
Since the beginning, there's been issues associated with two aspects. One is the issue of health communication, right? Who is the spokesperson has always been a question, right? Who's speaking out for the federal government? Who's speaking out at the state and local level? And what is politics? How is politics getting involved in all this? Right now, we're still sort of in a dilemma where the spokespeople at least are more aligned at the federal level. But certainly this whole idea of making sure that we get the information out, right? Part of it is health communication. Part of it is health literacy. We have to make sure that the public understands what we're talking about. And that's a key feature in all this. So, in this latest dilemma, right, health communication and health literacy still remain focus areas that we've really not achieved the highest levels that we need to achieve at, right? People need to understand what we're talking about, and we need to be consistent in our messaging. That's not gone really well since the beginning of this
pandemic. Dr. Lushniak, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
So beyond the problem of still getting everybody vaccinated the first time, now the CEO of Pfizer is saying we're likely going to need a booster shot in the next few months. Israel's already doing it, but Dr. Fauci and the FDA seem to be pushing back on that. So what's the right thing to do? What's going on here? Why the confusion?
Well, I think Pfizer was a little premature in terms of coming out with their recommendation. Don't forget that in terms of how vaccines are utilized, we really have two bodies here in the United States which really come up with the recommendations of vaccine use. One is the Food and Drug Administration, and the other is CDC and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Both these organizations are data-driven. Pfizer has its own data. The real sort of process that needs to exist is and I'm happy that at least there was a meeting between government officials and Pfizer recently, is Pfizer needs to submit the information they have. And ultimately, the decision on booster or not booster is not a Pfizer decision. Ultimately, it's data that's given to the regulating bodies, the recommending bodies regarding the immunization, and then decisions are made. What's going on in Israel is very interesting because Israel has made a decision. But don't forget, that's specifically for immunocompromised individuals, right? Higher risk individuals that are not getting a booster. I'm not saying we're not going to be getting a booster sometime in the future, but right now it's premature. What we need to do right now is to assure that people are getting the 2 doses of the vaccines that are the 2-dose vaccines and that they're getting the single dose of the single-dose vaccine. We have to make sure that that's being done correctly and that we ultimately increase the percentage of people who are taking the vaccine.
As you know, Dr. Lushniak, this has unfortunately become a political issue for many. And now one of the debates is, should the federal government, local governments mandate vaccinations? What do you say to that?
Well, that's always a touchy issue, and there's legal implications in terms of mandating something that is still under emergency use authorization, as opposed to being fully licensed by the Food and Drug Administration. I'm not a lawyer, but from the aspects of the legal situation, that certainly needs to be fully investigated. Certainly, entities have the ability to mandate it. I'm the dean of the School of Public Health at the University of Maryland. The whole University of Maryland system, under Chancellor Jay Furman, who happens to be a physician, made a decision now several weeks ago. And that decision was, we're mandating vaccines for our students, for our faculty and staff, for return to campus. My sense is, I think that's the right approach. Whether the feds need to get involved in that mandate situation, whether that needs to be done at the local level or at the state level, or even at the specific employer level, that's to be determined. I believe that the end of this pandemic will only occur once we have higher levels of response to the vaccination program. And it's not just in the United States. Don't forget that this pandemic doesn't end until the world is taken care of. And right now we have 25% of the world population having gotten 1 dose. And that's not adequate to end this pandemic.
All right, Dr. Boris Lushniak, again, thank you so much for being here with your helpful answers to what's going on. Appreciate it very much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices that are being made. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law&Crime Trial Network. Time now for this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlin, who's the editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law&Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. And Aidan, we begin with your winner this week, John Dickerson, the anchor of the CBS News Face the Nation program, for his probing interview with Dr. Anthony Fauci.
And I ask you about human psychology. You say the facts are hitting people between the eyes. Is it possible that people are a little scared, a little nervous, and the more facts they hear, they don't hear evidence. What they hear is, you're a dummy for not getting this. And that essentially people feel insulted when the evidence is presented as if it should be clearly obvious to any normal person. And that all that does is put them back in their corner.
You have a point there.
Aidan, that was a tough question, the kind of question you really haven't heard asked of Dr. Fauci so far with all the interviews he's done.
That's right. I mean, John Dickerson, who was hosting Face the Nation there on CBS News, and Dr. Anthony Fauci were discussing just how many Americans remain vaccine hesitant. And Fauci was lamenting that the vaccines have become such a partisan issue in the United States. Now, Dickerson raised a really good point, and I think a lot of people actually believe this, which focused on the messaging of how the messaging of vaccines are being delivered. Now, despite the wave of criticism that Fauci has received in the past year, I don't think he's to blame for the politicization of the vaccine. But I think a lot of people have felt that the push for vaccines from public health experts has often come off as either tone deaf or even arrogant. So John Dickerson raising that point in that interview was really well done. It was a welcome question, and kudos to Anthony Fauci for agreeing that it's one that needs to be considered.
That was an important interview. Let's turn now to this week's loser at Fox News, Maria Bartiromo, for her interview with the former president of the United States.
And they want answers as far as why this wonderful woman, young woman who went to peaceful protest, was shot. Do you have any information? There is speculation that this was a security detail in a leading member of Congress's security detail, a Democrat. What can you tell us in terms of who shot Ashley Babbitt? What do you know, Mr. President?
That was quite a question she asked. Why was she chosen as the loser this week, Aidan?
You can follow this under the latest shocking piece of journalistic malpractice from Maria Bartiromo. It came in an interview with the former president on Sunday and included the two of them speculating wildly that the police officer who shot Capitol rioter Ashley Babbitt was part of a prominent Democrat security detail. Neither Maria Bartiromo nor Donald Trump provided any evidence for that claim. And the next day, both NBC News and CNN came out with reporting that refuted it. According to that reporting, that police officer was not part of any Democrat security detail. It was just an astonishingly reckless thing for someone who calls himself the news anchor to speculate about on air without any actual reporting behind it. And the interview with Trump was filled with that kind of stuff. This just felt to me like the most glaring example of it.
And as you say, and we just have 5 seconds here, she is not an opinion, she's a news anchor, right?
Yes, somehow Fox still calls Maria Bartiromo a news anchor, not an opinion host, which I don't think many will buy into.
All right. Aidan McLaughlin, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to all the editors at Mediaite, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll be back here next week, and thanks again to the great staff at Law&Crime.